Welcome to Insider Events, financing a sustainable future, advancing effective corporate governance, in partnership with Bank of America. Here is our host, Future of Business Editor at Insider, Tim Parody.
Hi, I'm Tim Parody, Insider's Future of Business Editor. I'm honored to host this fourth installment of our series, Financing a Sustainable Future. Today, we're talking about governance. Governance is perhaps the most difficult to measure aspect of ESG reporting. It's its own theme, yet it also acts like a capstone, tying numerous ideas together. That's because all of the well-intentioned ideas around environmental or social efforts don't really matter if they're not properly implemented, or in a way that is keeping with the company's ideals. That's where governance comes in. Governance is one of the four pillars of ESG investing that the World Economic Forum has defined. They are people, planet, prosperity, and principles of governance, all of which we've discussed in depth during this series. Getting governance right goes to the core of how a company operates. Is an organization truly doing right by customers, employees, shareholders, suppliers, and members of the communities in which it operates? These are difficult questions, and in some cases, business models might be at odds with achieving these goals. There are five main principles of good governance: accountability, leadership, integrity, stewardship, and transparency. Governance is not only about principles like trust and, where appropriate, transparency. It's also about companies deciding how effective their other principles will be, or whether they'll take the easy route and whitewash or maybe greenwash their efforts. We'd love for you to join the conversation on social media by using the hashtags #InsiderEvents and Sustainable Future. You can also submit questions for our panelists through the dashboard at the bottom of the screen. And of course, we want your feedback. So in the dashboard, you'll see an icon for our survey. You can take it at any time during or just after the event. Now I'm delighted to introduce my guests. Mario Bassi, Head of Global Climate Risk at Bank of America.
Hey, Tim.
Jennifer Steinman, Global Sustainability and Climate Practice Leader at Deloitte. And Carolyn Roan, Chief Sustainability Officer at Pfizer. So Mary, we'll start with you. Can you please tell us what's most significant about your role in terms of governance?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so if you really think about the core tenets of managing risk well, it focuses on really four principles. One is around making sure you can identify all the risks that we face. And so in my role as a climate risk executive, that's one of the things I focus on from a climate perspective. We focus on, how do we ultimately measure and monitor the risks that we face? And then finally, we focus on how do we actually control and manage the risks that we face. And that's where there's a real intersection between what I do and this topic around governance. Because it's all well and good to understand and understand your exposure to various risks, but you also need to make sure that the right rigor and the right processes are set up so that key executives across our company are thinking about making decisions about and is ultimately managing the risk that they face. And that's one of my jobs as head of global climate risk at Bank of America.
Interesting. And Jennifer, can you talk about what's important to your role as it ties in with governance?
So from the role that I play, which is practice leader for Deloitte around sustainability, I'm really trying to work with our teams to help our clients look at governance and think about how it fits in from an end-to-end perspective, how you go from setting objectives that are important in this space to monitoring the outcomes to governing. So it's an entire life cycle and really trying to embed that in what companies do on a day-to-day basis, same as many of their other practices as well.
And finally, Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about your role as it relates to Pfizer? It's a company we've all grown to know very well in recent years.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you, Tim, for the opportunity to be here. So I wear multiple hats. I am our Chief Sustainability Officer, but I also oversee a group called Global Health and Social Impact, and I oversee our Pfizer Foundation. So practically, what does that mean from a governance perspective? It means that I work with our executive leadership team, our board, and our senior business leaders across functions to chart what I say is a sort of responsible business growth strategy and report out on that. And that allows us then to deliver on our purpose, which has been very singular and important in the most recent years for Pfizer, which is breakthroughs that change patients' lives. And so in that context, you really do have to marshal, I think, as Marian has and I were chatting before this session, really marshal all of the resources of the company to work together to do that prioritization and that reporting.
Of course. So I'll talk a little bit more about this now. Measuring what is good governance can be more difficult than, say, tracking greenhouse gases or the presence of historically disadvantaged groups within an organization in certain roles. Because of the challenge of quantifying what it means to have good governance, there's room for latitude and in the standards and metrics. And actions on environmental or social efforts can be greenwashed, as I mentioned in the introduction, or even slow walked if a company isn't truly committed to ESG principles. How would you say a company can hold itself accountable in a way that's transparent to stakeholders? Mary, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, Tim, I would even go back to one of the core principles you called out of good governance, which is transparency. I think a good way for a company to stay accountable, both for the goals that it's setting around sustainability, or frankly, any goals, is to make sure that, the company has defined what are the key metrics that helps track its progress towards achieving those goals and objectives. And ultimately being transparent about that information and that data. And that's one of the reasons that you've seen Bank of America play a role. You've seen our CEO play a role with the World Economic Forum in terms of laying out what key metrics could look like from a sustainability perspective. And obviously, there's been just quite a bit of work and movement from a regulatory perspective around climate-related disclosures and being really able to standardize against key metrics and really help investors understand where various companies stand relative to climate-related topics and goals. And so I think transparency is a really good way to make sure that you're staying accountable both within the company but also towards all your various stakeholders when it comes to the goals that you're setting around sustainability.
Interesting. Carolyn, can you talk a little bit about how you think companies can make sure they're essentially walking the walk?
Sure. Well, maybe I'll build first on the transparency piece. I think the nature of our work, discovering, developing, and bringing to market medicines and vaccines, has required us to embrace the requests by our patients and by our shareholders for radical transparency across the development cycle, right? Especially with COVID. People are asking in-depth questions about how do you discover that vaccine? What were the clinical trials like? How did you work with the regulatory authorities? So I think in that context, being responsive to that outward sort of, I don't even want to use a pressure, but conversation around we need to understand and unpack how you're doing your business is forcing that level of transparency. And I think the pull through, Tim, is really around the culture of the company. And so when you have a culture where you're comfortable with that level of transparency and your colleagues demand that you are really thinking, in our case, about that patient first, that then holds, it sort of holds the company and our senior leadership accountable through our colleague base.
Jennifer, can you weigh in on this and how you best measure good governance?
Thanks, Tim. And I agree with what my fellow panelists have shared. And I think maybe just to add on a little bit, the sort of the principle that what gets measured gets done, I think is important here. And so we look at ESG measures, it's important to approach those metrics with the same level of rigor that organizations apply to other operating metrics. And so controls and management oversight and risk processes applied to ESG metrics should parallel any other set of metrics and KPIs as well. And so I think that's one really critical item is that we treat this as part of a general process that's applied with the same rigor. And then probably one other thought is that it's not just the measurement and the KPIs that one needs to chase after. It's also transparency around where the organization has actually moved and what actions are being taken. That level of transparency around what's happening in the supply chain, for example, is going to be increasingly important over time, in particular with greater rigor around those metrics. And then finally, and I think Mary was talking about this, it's a little bit fuzzy in terms of the regulatory environment. It's lumpy across the globe. And so looking to bodies like the World Economic Forum for some direction around what metrics should we be looking at is really important as well.
Absolutely. Many companies have set clear goals on their ESG performance, and many boards appear committed. And setting aside those companies that might be doing this for show, how do the leaders who really want these ESG principles to trickle down through an organization and make sure they do? Essentially, how do they create buy-in? Mary, I'll go to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's sort of the core to this question around governance, right? Because at the end of the day, what you want to look for is, as a company sets a goal, you want to understand how they're monitoring their progress to the goal, as Jen was talking about, and what is the progress they're making relative to the goal. What do they still have to do? What challenges are they facing? So again, it comes back to that point around just disclosure and transparency. I do also think there is, just to touch upon also what Jen was talking about, just in terms of culture, there's a piece around you want to make sure all your senior executives are, talking about the mission, are embedding it in their respective functions, or making sure, or basically being the voice. And you see that with, what our CEO has done. Our Vice Chair, Paul D'Onofrio, has talked a lot about the goals that we've set at Bank of America in terms of, achieving net zero by 2050, mobilizing, $1.5 trillion in sustainable finance by 2030. But there's also, with a large company, you want to make sure you're also mobilizing sort of your mid-level managers as well to sort of carry the torch forward in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis. And then even beyond that, your whole kind of employee base, right? And so one of the things that we've done, a couple of things I think that we've done that's really helped us on that front is we've really made sure that it's clear that these goals that we've set from a climate perspective are sort of logical steps based on our responsible growth sort of mantra and strategy that sort of underpins everything we do as a company. And we've ensured that there is employee networks. We have an employee network called My Environment where we've got like 23,000 of our employees have signed up for that and are thinking about ways to embed, action around climate in what they do on a day-to-day basis, as well as what they do on a day-to-day from a work perspective. And so that gets you beyond sort of, again, having these sort of very top level goals that may be disassociated from what folks are doing on a day-to-day basis, to really kind of embedding and baking it into everything we do as a company.
Thank you. Jennifer, can you weigh in on how to best promote this idea throughout a company?
It's interesting to do the zoom in the way Mary just did, and maybe the zoom out. We did a study recently with 2,000 CXOs, and just to gauge the attitude with regard to this topic. And it's interesting results, because we've done 2 of these studies now, and we're showing a trend that CXOs believe we're at a tipping point. So 79% believe we're at a tipping point, about 2,000 CXOs, 21 countries. And then 97% of them say that their companies themselves have been affected by climate change. And so, when we start to look at that, then the question is, well, what is actually happening and what are they doing about it? There's a high degree of optimism around ability for us to stave off the worst of climate impact. 88% think that we can do this. And then you start to say, well, have you action goals relative to that? And we look at embedding certain key actions that demonstrate that commitment. So a lot of organizations have now said, here's what we're trying to do and how we're trying to achieve it. But we do see a pretty big disconnect between those organizations that are actually making that commitment relative to the action. And so when we look for that, and Mary described a bunch of them, are you developing and or thinking about products, services, that are, sustainable in nature? Have you started working with your suppliers and helping them think through sustainability criteria? Are you thinking about where you're located, and your facilities? Are they in climate resistant areas? Have you thought about the work that's being done from a policy perspective? Are you trying to influence policy as an organization? And then importantly, is compensation and performance management tied to this at a senior level? And I would argue that as we get further into this, it has to go deeper into the organization as well. We only see 19% of organizations doing these needle moving actions today. And so it shows there's the intention is there, the desire is there, but the action hasn't quite caught up with that yet.
A lot of work to do for sure. Carolyn, you've said that the ESG goals of a company like Pfizer are what can bring people to the company. Can you elaborate and talk a little bit about how businesses can create a culture around governance that can sort of act as a beacon for would-be workers?
Sure. And I love that we have different industries represented on this conversation, right? I think for us, what has been a real driver for that is that, when we deliver on our business purpose, which is bringing that innovation, right? These breakthroughs to patients, we deliver for society. And with that comes huge expectations for how we operate. But at the same time, it really pulls people who are truly purpose-driven. And so I think, interestingly, the pharmaceutical industry, and Pfizer specifically, is so well poised to pull through ESG in a meaningful way. And just to give you an example, our current CEO set a new strategy when he came on board. And that included a new set of values, our new purpose, and a set of very prioritized areas of focus around innovation, science, and patients. We then used that framework to set the priority areas for our ESG strategy. We now have 28 areas that we're tracking and associated metrics. And his entire point there was that, back to the point that you don't do what you don't measure, is that we had targets in place. Everybody has been united around that purpose. And I think it has served us so well to get that traction that you need to drive ESG through the full organization, and then to have people come to us and say, we want to work for Pfizer because you're doing things that meaningfully impact patients' lives and communities. And then the final point, I think, to what Jen said is compensation. We know that, that matters in terms of the ability for this to have staying power. And we do have an ESG scorecard that we use in our global performance management system. And I think that has also served to sort of solidify that commitment all the way through the organization.
Interesting. So I'd like to talk a little bit about prioritization. I'm wondering how companies should attempt to balance the sort of often varied and perhaps competing goals of ESG targets. Can you give an example, Jennifer, of how you've seen a company or Delight successfully navigate this conundrum?
So in terms of prioritization, the way I've been thinking about it, and as we see companies start to think about how they look at the questions associated with ESG, is are you on an offense or a defense kind of play? And from a defense perspective, you tend to see organizations looking at what must we do, and that's deeply tied to the regulatory environment. And those that are moving closer to an offense play, what can we and what should we do? And they're starting to look at it from embedding in strategy. And it's a shift in terms of, does it fit into their cultures, the values of the organization, but also if there's a belief that there's a revenue upside. And so the companies that have really moved the needle more tend to see it as an upside. It's both the right thing to do as well as the right thing to do for the growth and sustainability of the business overall. And so those are the kinds of things that I think we see as a bit of a dichotomy today, but moving into the direction of seeing the upside is really where you see most of the organizations that have done the greatest transformation.
It'll be fascinating to watch that switch continue. Mary, I was going to ask you, how do we continue to work through our fiduciary responsibilities while still meeting our ESG goals?
Yeah, I was also going to just touch upon, Jen, what you were talking about, because I do think at the core of the concept of sustainability, and just look at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, right? They all kind of build and feed on each other in some ways, right? You almost you can't really get one done really well without some of the others, right? As we're talking about governance, but you do also need to have a consideration for the societal impacts, and you have to have a consideration for the environmental impacts, because they're also tightly correlated and interrelated. And I think, at least in terms of what we've done at the company in thinking through that, one of the things that has really undergirded our efforts, in addition to looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals, is also, when you think about climate, is we know there's going to be a transition, right, to a lower carbon economy. And to Jen's point, there's tremendous upside, right? There's a number of different studies out there, right? Anywhere between $5 to $9 trillion a year, right, of capital that needs to be mobilized to achieve that goal between now and 2050, right? So there's tremendous upside, right? There's tremendous opportunity, right, associated with that. But then there's also the reality of the impacts, right? Again, if you look at some of the climate science, the reality of the impacts that are going to be felt by so many different communities, everyone from our employees to the clients that we serve to the various businesses. So there's also that imperative, right? And so I really think of these goals not so much as a question of prioritization, but being really thoughtful of how can you make sure that your goals and your targets are really complementary.
Yeah, that's a good answer to that in terms of trying to strike that balance. That's interesting. Carolyn, what about maybe from you? How do companies achieve that balance between the fiduciary responsibilities and the ESG goals?
Great question. And I think from our perspective, when we think about ES&G, we're probably disproportionately focused on the S component. And from an E perspective, it's table stakes. Like we have to get involved because we do have a climate crisis in front of us. And sometimes those debates include, okay, we just had to increase production to meet the goals on the vaccine for the world. What does that mean for carbon emissions, and how do we offset that later? So those conversations are very active and real. But I think to your point about fiduciary responsibility, the issue for us, of course, is access and affordability of our medicines and vaccines. And just to give you a sense of how we do balance that, one of the most recent announcements Pfizer made was around making our medicines and vaccines available to the 45 poorest countries of the world at a not-for-profit basis. That was a huge move for us, and we did that not because we were concerned about making more money or losing money in those markets, because we felt like we had that responsibility, and that, as Mary alluded to, the impact of COVID on communities was not the same. And there were communities that were left out, and that the health outcomes were already fragile, were now more fragile. And so from our perspective, we're constantly listening to our stakeholders and constantly having those conversations with patients around where we need to take action. And then we need to have the fortitude and the strength to provide that leadership at the highest level of the company and through the board, which I believe is really a critical component of that, because if you don't have your board engaged in these conversations, it's going to make that process a lot more difficult.
That's a nice segue to the next question that I had, which was getting into some of the practical considerations. I'm wondering how companies pursue their ESG targets. Do they do it with separate committees or boards, or should everyone do a full board? Jennifer, we'll start with you.
It's an interesting question, one that's come up quite a bit as I spend time with board members in different companies, and it's really the content of what gets done that's the most important aspect of this. And boards are at different levels of understanding, knowledge. There's still some education that needs to take place, both at the board level and throughout the organization, in terms of even the basics of the terminology and the environment that we're in, and how one should think about it. And then there's a question around, is it, to your point, is it a distinct committee or is it embedded? We find different practices in the boards that we've taken a look at, but it tends to be trending towards it's a responsibility for the entire board, and it tends to be trending towards therefore put it into governance, but it's an important piece of the responsibility of an overall board objective. And so, where you might have seen distinct committees popping up a bit, that's now starting to move away from the trending and trying to figure out how you discuss this across the continuum of the committees. And it's not just the questions of what types of objectives are being set, but it's the how, it's the why, and it's the how fast that boards are now starting to turn to, which I think is a very important shift and progression from the commitments that organizations make to the actions and the outcomes that they're driving.
Absolutely. Mary, any thoughts on how to best approach this from the standpoint of the boards and committees? I know you made reference to it earlier.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jen hit on it perfectly. I mean, if you think about all the various examples and aspects that we've talked about, like I loved, Carolyn, what you were talking about in terms of, one of the first actions of the Pfizer CEO was to really sort of say, hey, these are all the different areas from a sustainability perspective where we've got to set targets. And similarly, right, at Bank of America, we've done likewise. We've thought about where are the opportunities in this space, and how do we achieve those opportunities? We've touched on what are the risks in this space, and how do we manage those risks well. There's a lot of work, Jen, to the point that you were saying. There's sort of new metrics, right? Folks are focused on emissions data and how to understand that, right? So again, while you do have committees at the board level, right? We have an enterprise risk committee. We have a corporate environmental social governance committee that may care for various aspects of the strategy that we set in the various targets. It is, in my view, very important that the whole board has an oversight over the sustainability goals, because it really can touch upon all aspects of an organization.
So, Carolyn, what about you? What should the setup look like in your?
Sure. Well, similarly, we have different board committees that have, some responsibility, governance and sustainability. We have our enterprise risk. We also have our compensation committee now engaged. But I think, to Jen's point, that all rolls up to the overall board engagement and focus on this area. But that said, I think what has served us well is the discipline of putting a structure in place below that. And that sort of serves to drive both the accountability of that measurement through the organization. And we didn't have that in place initially, and we learned through our process. So we have a couple of different committees. We have a senior level sustainability committee that feeds these reports up to the board. And that allows us to bring all those holders, those technical experts together to talk about that prioritization. I think that's been really critical. The other one, which we used, was what I affectionately call our kitchen cabinet of our executive leadership team. And we bring them together to debate and discuss some of these areas of focus. Should we be adding metrics or priority areas within E? How are we handling, future more aggressive targets in the environmental space, and what are the implications? And what that allows us to do is to have important perspectives shared before it rolls up to the CEO and then in turn through these board committees. And I think that's meant that people are on board when the decision, forgive my pun, on board when the decision is taken to, either make those changes or aggressively pursue new areas of focus. So I would encourage companies who are, more nascent in their work in this space to really consider how that structure and discipline underneath the board serves to support your overall goals.
Interesting. That's good advice, I'm sure. So part of the challenge around this is knowing what to track. There are so many components to governance. Can you talk a little bit about, I'm going to ask each of you to talk a little bit about how you decide what makes the cut in your scoring governance. Mary, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, again, I really strongly believe that I think, Jen, you said it right. What gets measured gets managed, gets monitored, and gets tracked. And so, from a climate risk perspective, I sort of talked a little bit about, how we think about managing and understanding climate risk. It starts with understanding the risk that it impact all of our lines of businesses in varied ways. Starts with being able to assess and monitor and understand sort of the magnitude of our exposure to those risks. And that's really how we start to track and sort of say this makes the cut, because it to us seems like something that could have implications for our lines of businesses or for how we run our business. The other side of that is as I mentioned, we've got some very specific goals that we've set, right? And we've talked about the net zero by 2050 commitment, the mobilizing $1.5 trillion by 2030, and how are we doing that? And again, we have to monitor and manage that and track that alongside any other business goal that we would set. And so that's really how we decide what makes the cut.
Carolyn, how do you determine what should be measured when it comes to governance?
Sure. Well, I think we have a similar process, which is really around that engagement with external stakeholders, as well as our colleagues to understand what those priority areas are. To give you a window of that, as we talked about, we think environment is table stakes. So we've got carbon, we've got water. We are, continuing to look if we need to be more aggressive in that space, because we see some real leadership from even the companies on this panel discussion. And so we're looking at that space. S remains critical. So we've set very specific DE&I targets. And that's when we took a step back and said, do we have the representation from women in leadership? Do we have the representation, particularly in the US, in terms of minority populations at the VP and higher level? And similarly to Mary's point, we've set specific targets, moving from the single percentages all the way through to double percents, hopefully above 30%, now on our way to more than 50%. And then on access and affordability, we have some patient reach numbers. We've heard very clearly from our stakeholder engagement on this, not sufficient. And so we're looking at how we measure that patient impact overall in the affordability piece. And finally, on the G side, it is that classic sense of how we are managing and handling risk, the structures that we've talked about that we've put in place. But that conversation can't just happen one time. It's a constant sort of engagement and dialogue and a process of reviewing that and then having those conversations up through the ranks of the company.
Thanks for that insight. Jennifer, do you have a way of thinking about how to know what to measure when it comes to governance?
Such great answers from our panelists, and I think it shows both how organizations can look outside for important areas to look at from a governance perspective, and then also to report on. And there's industry standards, there's broader standards, but also then when it gets right down to it, it's the organization itself and trying to figure out what matters that's related to our strategy. So when we talk with clients, we're looking to see where they currently are, and it can run the gamut from, we've been doing this from an unstructured and potentially ungoverned perspective, need to understand what our stakeholders believe is important, internal and external, need to get a better understanding of what the regulations are and how we're going to report against the regulatory environment, and then start to chip away at it. And I absolutely agree, Carolyn, with what you were saying, is it's not one pass and done, in particular because this is such an evolving environment that we're in, and there's changes in the regulations happening as we speak. And so it's really important to take one pass at it, establish the same kind of discipline you would for any other reporting. I think the only other thing that we haven't really talked about is access to data, and that is potentially challenging as well when you're trying to access data within your organization. And then as we talk about things associated with scope 3 as an example, now you're looking outside of your organization and you're trying to make sure that that information is correct, and that you're working with organizations, potentially your suppliers, to help them on their journey as well. And that requires quite a bit of incremental muscle that most organizations are still starting to work on.
That's interesting that you mentioned challenges. I'd like to dig into that a little bit. What would you say are the biggest challenges, maybe the top things at the top of your to-do list, Carolyn?
Well, maybe I'll pick up on what Jen said about reporting standards. I mean, it's an alphabet soup, right? And I feel as though there's sort of new initiatives underway by lots of different groups looking at this, collective set of issues of how do you report, what do you report, how do you, measure that over time. So I would say that from my perspective, just cutting through that and trying to figure out what makes most sense We try to report our priorities against SASB, against the Global Reporting Initiative standards, the Sustainable Development Goals, and we do it in a chart in the back of our, report. That's probably insufficient over time. We're going to have to get more sophisticated in that space, and I think we're watching that regulatory environment, as Jen said, very, very carefully to make sure we're equipped for that. And I thought the other point that is something that I worry a lot about is that mining of data inside the organization, because your systems are not set up to do this type of reporting with the oversight and accountability that you need. And so there's a lot of energy and time on at least in my mind and from our team, in thinking through how do we put those controls in place? How do we use technology to support this effort in terms of that transparency and reporting? And that's not a small task for large organizations, for sure.
Not at all. I wouldn't want to have to be in charge of that myself. Jennifer, are there to-dos or governance challenges that keep you up at night? Think about this.
I think what we've just been talking about is really sort of at the crux of it, which is there's a lot happening at the same time. There's changing regulatory environment. There is the question around unintended consequences, and so Carolyn, I think you were touching upon it a little bit, which is if I have one change that's particularly good for the environmental side of this equation, but then I'm having an impact on the just transition side of the equation. And so it's actually quite complex, and trying to have a holistic view and make sure that this is not a side of desk kind of activity for organizations, I think is probably the one thing that keeps me up at night as we look at this.
And Mary, what do you see as sort of top hurdles around this, around governance?
Yeah, I mean, both Jen and Carolyn hit on items on my list too. I mean, definitely the data challenge is significant. I can't emphasize enough, again, how granular this data can get. A lot of it is very new. A lot of it is, and it's a lot of data that we have to, in our case, we're collecting it from our supply chain, but we're also collecting it from our clients in order to be able to measure our scope part of our scope 3, our financed emissions. And a lot of it is net new data, and it does require stitching together a lot of new systems together and making things talk together that haven't had to in the past. And then when you also have the additional challenge around, even with the work that we've done, for example, from a risk perspective around climate scenario analysis, you're dealing with, again, models that are new and that we're having to sort of bake in and integrate with our financial models. You're dealing with models that go out to very long-term horizons, right? We're talking about setting targets decades out, right? So typically, sort of the planning horizon for us is typically between 3 to 5 years. We're talking about commitments and targets that we're setting out at 2030, 2050. And so even that is a challenge in terms of how do you structure your governance and your oversight to make sure that you stay on that path towards achieving those, even as the world continues to move and change, and things happen literally every other day. And so all of that is, I think, very challenging in this space.
Absolutely. I'd kind of like to build on that now and talk a little bit about, I guess, what we haven't talked about, which is the factors that maybe are most overlooked in the discussions around governance. So as companies amend and set new goals, and as you pointed out, Mary, that these often are set decades at a time, how do they make sure their ESG priorities incorporate anything that they might have been missing? Carolyn, can you share your thoughts on this?
Well, I've talked about the important role that stakeholders and engagement, and when I say stakeholders, I mean investors, I mean patients, all of our customers, whatever industry you're in, play in helping us make sure that we've got a process of identifying these issues in place that's durable. And I think that's one of the things that companies really need to think about. That's what we've talked about in terms of putting these structures around governance in place. If they're in place, they're doing their job, which is listening to stakeholders, engaging with regulators, then hopefully we're able to capture, as the world moves and as these issues change, and we're able to deliver, what we need to in that spirit of being a really responsible corporate citizen and growing our business acknowledging the challenges that we face from a societal perspective.
And Mary, what about you? Can you talk about any ideas do you think might have been missing from this discussion on corporate governance in recent years?
I wouldn't say that so much as missing, but I think just again, I we already touched upon this point, but as much as various companies are setting out their sustainability goals, as much as companies can make sure that it is aligned with their overall corporate strategy, corporate goals, right? For Bank of America, our strategy is around responsible growth, and when you think about the targets and the commitments we set, it fits very squarely around that responsible growth tenet in terms of growing with a customer focus. Many of our customers have set net zero commitments and targets, so it makes sense for us to think about how we continue to serve those customers well. Sustainability is part of responsible growth, and so again, obviously, the commitments and the targets we're setting sits very squarely within that. Being able to grow and win in the market, I talked about the opportunities that there are in the climate space, and again, so that sits very squarely in terms of what we do. And then we grow within our risk framework, hence kind of a focus and the function that I lead in terms of making sure that we're doing a great job in managing all the risks associated with climate as part of everything else that we're doing. So again, it all sits and it ties very squarely with our overall strategy as a company. And I think as companies are continuing to set these goals, especially if they're longer term goals, that's key to making sure that you have kind of long-term sustainable success in achieving these targets.
Interesting. Same question to you, Jennifer. What might we have overlooked?
I think this has been a really great, robust conversation. It may be the area that I see potential for evolving and hopefully sooner versus later is really getting a consistent standard for measurement. And I think that would really help organizations. And I know that our fellow panelists here are probably involved in a lot of work to influence policy. I think that's really important to bring sort of pragmatic business sense to that. Certainly, Deloitte is involved in many of those efforts and starting to think about what metrics can be universal in nature, relevant to creating long term value, actionable, really important that it's more than just a measure that's a static measure, and improve comparability of information when we're looking at it from an investor and a stakeholder perspective. So I think those are some of the things that really need to happen next.
Interesting. A lot to do still. So for our last question, I wanted to just dig a little bit more on something we touched on earlier, which is this notion of executive compensation. Some companies are taking steps to tie this to their performance against ESG metrics, as we talked about. But I'm wondering how you think this might change behavior, how successful it can be, and how do we sort of guard against this criticism that I've seen where some people say the targets are watered down and therefore not that hard to meet for the executives. Mary, can you talk to this a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, similar to what Carolyn described, we look at a range we also have a scorecard that is included and reviewed as part of executive compensation, which does include a number of ESG metrics and score and indicators. And, those are part of the factors that are considered. We have obviously a pay for performance culture, but we also think about the long term and the sustainability of how executives are achieving their goals. So not just what do they achieve, but also how have they achieved it, and how does it tie back again to our responsible growth strategy and with the overall ESG targets and goals that we've set. So that's how we look at it. And I think it is important to look at a range of metrics when determining executive compensation.
What about you, Jennifer? How do you think companies should establish compensation targets that drive action on behalf of ESG metrics?
I think it's corollary is you get what you measure, and then from a performance management perspective, what are the goals of that executive team, and are they rewarded for achieving those goals? It's a similar kind of approach, and from my perspective, I think it's really important, and I think Mary was describing it, is that it's integrated into an overall system for performance management, so that it is core to the strategy. Execution on the strategic choices involve execution of ESG related choices as well. And that actually will help not only the performance of the organization, but also the embedding that we've been talking about throughout. So it's not one of those things that's on the side, and that lends itself to having deeper impact on the organization and our communities at large.
Great. And Carolyn, what do you think the answer is for tying compensation to ESG?
Well, I am proud that the company took the step to start our ESG scorecard. I think that's critical. I think, as Mary said, there are multiple factors that need to be considered in that. But I also don't want to underestimate the power of purpose. And I hate to, sound cheeky about that. But for us, that purpose-driven agenda cannot be understated in how executives hold themselves and their teams accountable. That is what we're measured by. Breakthroughs that change patients' lives. That is translated into metrics associated with our innovation pipeline, how many patients we reach. And I think that's powerful for all companies as they think through how to make this work in governance be sustained over time and supportive of an entire ESG framework.
A great note to end on. Thank you all. I'd like to thank today's panelists, Mary, Jennifer, and Carolyn, for the fascinating insights they shared. And I'd like to thank our presenting partner, Bank of America. Governance will no doubt remain an essential yet challenging and ever-changing area for companies and the boards that run them. Without good governance, after all, it's likely not going to be possible to achieve the environmental and social benchmarks that many companies have laid out, and their workers, customers, suppliers, and shareholders expect them to achieve. And remember, you can share your thoughts using the hashtags Insider Events and Sustainable Future. In a few moments, our survey will pop up on your screen. We'd love to get your feedback so we can keep on improving. Thank you again for joining us, and have a wonderful day.